Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of CPP's events at Labour Party Conference. I'm really excited to join you and being part of Labour Connected. For someone who's been going to party conferences for many years now, this is very unusual, and I think it's great that Labour are kicking off this season of online party conferences in the way that they have. So thank you, and as Sarah says, just bear with us with the technology a little bit. Hopefully throughout the course of the week we'll continue to get used to the platform. So by way of introduction, my name is Charlotte Aldrich. I am the director of the Centre for Progressive Policy. We're a think tank that is committed to and focused on inclusive economic growth. So we really are and have been thinking about how we do what this current government calls levelling up. We're very oriented towards what that really means for people and places, and it will be a core part, we believe, of how Labour wins back the former Red Wall areas, and that's the subject that we want to cover today. I think it's fair to say that the Red Wall is not just, or was not just part of Labour's winning electoral strategy, but it's kind of a key part of its very identity. And so I hope that throughout the course of the discussion, we'll think about what that means, given the current political context, what that should mean in terms of how Labour approaches what the Conservative Party have coined the levelling up agenda, and what its territory, its vision will be, and its policy agenda. Today we're focusing largely on the politics at our event tomorrow. So for those of you who are free, 2:30 till 3:30, please tune in to our policy discussion on how we deliver that. And then we'll be looking ahead on Wednesday and with an event with Annalisa Dodds on both levelling up but a kind of a wider economic agenda. But today really focusing on the politics. And we've got a fantastic list of speakers for you today. So we've got Henri Murison, who's director of the Northern Powerhouse. We've got Bridget Jones, deputy leader for Birmingham City Council. We've got Liam Byrne, who is the Labour Party candidate for Mayor for the West Midlands and former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, amongst other things. And then we've got Yvette, who is currently chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee. So phenomenal list of speakers, and we'll turn to them very shortly. Just before I do so, some quick bits of housekeeping. The event is being live recorded and will be streamed through CPP channels after the event today. If you want to get involved in the conversation, please use the chat function or raise your hand and ask a question once we get to that part of the discussion. And as Sarah says, suggest you use the speaker view so you can keep track of who's speaking when. If you've got any technical problems, also just pop them in the chat and we'll do our best to help you. So tweeting at #CPPLevelUp. If I can turn first to Henri Murison to kick things off. Sorry, you might need to unmute, Henri.
I think I'm on now. Sorry, apologies.
There we are.
Thank you, Charlotte. It's lovely. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. And it's great to join such a distinguished panel talking about what I think is such a key topic for Labour this week. So the Red Wall is kind of a very kind of well-used phrase. And this morning, a picture of Stoke was used to illustrate a story that was about the north of England. And that sort of sums up probably some of the challenges with this, which is that from London, it all looks the same, right? But in reality, Liam's part of the world, although there are parts of the West Midlands that share much commonality actually with the North's economic history, has many comparabilities, say, with a big metro mayoral area like West Yorkshire or Greater Manchester, but isn't really very like West Cumbria or the Teesside part of the world. And I think that kind of reality check that not all the north of England rejected Labour at the last election, but the mainly places with very low median wages very much did. And what that points to is that there are communities who have really struggled in the last few decades. And neither of the main political parties has had a compelling way of answering the problems and questions that come from that. So what we aren't really interested in politics, and we probably should be less interested in than we have been in the past, is simply putting a sticking plaster over those economic problems. And I think that as someone who was involved in work for the Labour Party and in local government at the time of the last Labour government, which now feels a very long time ago, I think it's unquestionable that Labour had a clear position on how we could improve public services and outcomes for people in those disadvantaged places. I think there was real gaps in the view, which wasn't a deliberate omission, but that have come back since, that some of the national economic success that was felt in many of that period, but not all of it, left some significant areas that hadn't felt the same benefits from the type of economic success that Labour did achieve in many parts of that time in government. And so you then have a Conservative government that rather late through the coalition also woke up to this problem, the same way that probably you could argue that regional development agencies and the move towards regional assemblies, which never quite happened, were probably Labour also kind of finding its way in this space. So how do you reconcile the need for a rational, sensible economic policy driven from Whitehall, but that recognises the fact that what moves economic activity isn't necessarily all controllable with those levers from the centre. And what we haven't had are democratic voices and those with the ability to make decisions for places independent of that traditional system. And that's really what we're talking about, is that in a week when Keir Starmer is very much woken up to the patriotism problem with Labour in the last election and some of the issues around values, which I know Yvette, representing one of these seats, will be able to talk about much more eruditely than I. But on the other side of that coin, there is just a north-south divide and a South Midlands and North divide, to describe it more economically rationally, which is that there are many parts of the country that have fallen very far behind London, the South East, in the last few decades. And you have to have an answer to that problem and recognise it is a real economic problem, because the fact is that productivity is lower on average in many of these parts of the country, those that I'm interested in, and also the ones that Liam seeks to represent as its Metro Mayor. And that causes lots of issues, not just in the more economically successful parts of those sort of mega regions, or whatever we want to call kind of those kind of multiple collaborations of travel to work areas, but it also means that dealing with problems on the fringe of those places is very difficult. So if you want to do something about deprivation and social inequality in London, the reality is what you're doing is connecting people with opportunities very nearby. So it is possible to do something about social mobility, as has been done in London the last 2 decades, because the challenges and opportunities are relatively physically close to each other to some of the huge prosperity. The reality is that is not the case in many parts of the north of England. It certainly isn't the case in parts of Teesside, and it certainly isn't the case in many of the seats that voted Conservative at the last election. And I think that you can, of course, think that Brexit means that that was a one-off, that somehow places that were left behind will just revert back to type. But I think my analysis, having in different ways worked in these communities for the whole of my professional career and in politics in the last 20 years, is that something has been significantly broken in those communities in terms of their relationship with the Labour Party. And I suppose the challenge for this conference is that, as well as talking about patriotism, I would argue that there needs to be a considered economic analysis and a plan for how you close that north-south divide that is more credible than the one the government are presenting. And I think there are lots of deficiencies in levelling up, in that, unlike the Northern Powerhouse, which was the government's previous policy in this area, that was a shared ambition with many in local government, levelling up is a much more political initiative, which feels as much about high streets on the southwest coast as it does about fundamental economic and social disadvantage because of poor schools in parts of County Durham. And I think that that's a mistake for the current government, because if this is simply about the types of promises and delivery you do in a budget, where you have some jam to spread around the country to make everyone feel like you've remembered where they live, then this government will pay the price for that. But on the contrary of that, if Labour don't have an answer for what we do about the fundamental social and economic disadvantage that comes from being far from opportunity, then it'll be very hard to get those people to come back to Labour and do so in enough numbers to be able to bring these seats back into the equation. And particularly if you discount the fact that Scotland is still a very challenging problem for the Labour Party, the reality is there is no route back to power for a Labour government that doesn't involve winning back the vast majority of seats that were lost in the last election and the election before. And a large percentage of those are in the north of England and in the Midlands. And I would sort of leave with the rest of the panel the kind of economic and political reality that there cannot be a Labour government that can't answer the question of what it's going to do about spatial disadvantage and about places being left behind. And your answers may be different, and I may not necessarily be the person with some of the right ones or the organisation with the right ones. But as you do, Charlotte, there are many of us who want to achieve a political consensus on the fact that we need to rebalance the country because this is going to take longer than any one parliament. And that does require, not just for political reasons, but also for this to be successful, for the Labour Party to be really clear about what it's going to be able to achieve for communities up and down the country, but in particularly those parts of the country that have chosen to turn away from it.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you, Henry. That was great. So I'm just going to move quickly now to Councillor Jones, because she can give a view from her local community in one of the biggest local authorities in the UK, near Europe, I think. So over to you, Councillor Brigid Jones, please.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to give a local authority perspective on this. So I think if we needed a reminder about how important place-based leadership is, the last few months of COVID have provided that. And I'll just start with an example of how local government has really shined through. So firstly, we've had the disaster of national government trying to impose national services for COVID uniformly across the country. And in doing so, not just ignoring local partnerships, but barely even stopping to consider whether they might be there already at all. And we've seen this played out back in March with the mess that was Operation Shield, and now with Test and Trace. And where councils have eventually been handed control, we've proved that we can be nimble and agile in a way that Whitehall simply cannot. And that's despite facing long-standing financial pressures. In the last few months, local government up and down the country has created new services, pulled partners together, and protected the most vulnerable as well. And secondly, we've had the pandemic play out very differently in different areas, and that's required different place-based policies to react. So since the Barnard Castle incident, public trust in national restrictions and adherence to them has shifted quite dramatically. But by demonstrating that when we ask the public to do something, it's scientifically backed up, tailored to their area and relevant to the way that they live their lives locally, we can start to win back some of those trusts and, crucially, compliance with what we all know are very often very painful local rules to follow. The LGA has done some polling that shows that resident satisfaction with local government's response to COVID is high, and councils are trusted to support communities in this national crisis. A record 75% of residents at the moment are satisfied with the way their local council runs things in their area. Ipsos Mori polling from the last year puts trust in local councillors at 41%. I hesitate to say this because we've got two wonderful, amazing former government ministers on the line, so no disrespect meant to them at all, but that is more than double at the moment what government ministers are getting at 17%, and nearly 3 times what politicians generally are getting at 14% public trusting them. Local government's got a track record, and it's earned the trust of people before and during COVID to a degree that national government just hasn't. And that's why it has to be a key cornerstone of delivering the levelling up agenda and Labour's plans for delivering change in the Midlands and the North. One size doesn't fit all for COVID, nor will it for recovery or for the shock that's going to come from Brexit just over the horizon. Different areas, as Henri was saying, have got different economic strengths and weaknesses, different population profiles, different histories, and also different senses of identity. And as one of the most centralised nations in Europe, it's easy to forget sometimes the scale of some of the areas that our councils cover. So there are 3 EU nation states at the moment with populations smaller than my city. If you look at the Metro Mayor area that Liam is contesting in the West Midlands, there are 7 EU nation states that are smaller. And if differences between places of this scale are enough to lead to entire separate countries forming elsewhere, we shouldn't be too surprised that in our country, they've got different identities and present different problems that require different approaches and different solutions here within the United Kingdom. And there's a really strong case, of course, that ignoring all of this through the last few decades of centralised decision-making has contributed to the inequalities that we have now. So my first point is that to get voters to identify with us in the red wall again, Labour's got to offer solutions that resonate with different areas and recognise that local government is a key and trusted asset in delivering those solutions. Now, on delivering those solutions, the two biggest challenges to councils are, of course, powers and finance. So since 2010, councils have lost 60p in every pound of central government funding. I'm just going to repeat that because most people don't believe me when I say it, but it's true. Since 2010, councils have lost 60p in every pound of central government funding. And our ability to raise revenue locally has not risen anywhere near enough to bridge that gap. Whilst at the same time, demand for our services has soared, with people across the country smashing into a wall of poverty and the cruelty of universal credit, and councils making heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking decisions about who to prioritise with not enough cash to go around. So the second point is, if we're going to unleash the potential of councils to deliver local solutions, Labour needs to have an answer to the issue of funding and fiscal devolution. And we also just politically need to be clear in laying the blame at the door of the Conservatives for leaving councils where they are, and stop internally battering our local councillors for living within our means of our budgets, as the law requires us to do. When it comes to powers, a key part of our recovery should be addressing the climate emergency, which 230 councils have so far declared, and nearly 2/3 of councils across the country hope to be carbon neutral by 2030. And councils can see the opportunity for driving huge change in their areas with this. LGA analysis suggests that up to 1.18 million jobs could be created in the low carbon sector by 2050. We know that we'll need an integrated and devolved employment and skills system to get people into these jobs. But for too long, national support for local growth like this has come with a lack of coordination between government departments and a complex framework for national funding and support. So LGA research on this in 2016 found that at that time, there was about £23 billion worth of public money being spent on growth, regeneration and skills. That money was being fragmented at the time across 70 different national funding streams managed by 22 different government departments and agencies. Obviously, that's a mess, and the evidence shows it hasn't been delivering in the way that we need it to. And an example of where this could go wrong again in the near future is the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. It's replacing EU funds. It's a significant opportunity to promote local growth, reduce regional disparities, and drive economic recovery. But that can only be achieved if the fund is a localised fund that's accountable to local people and places. My region of the West Midlands, Liam's region, is set to be the second worst hit region in England from a no deal scenario at the end of the year. But 3 months out from no deal, and we're still desperately in the dark about what it will look like and how the fund will work, with consultation with councils on Brexit barely existent. We mustn't end up with the Shared Prosperity Fund looking something like LEPS, where local decision making is, it happens, but with very, very little democratic accountability. And that's my third point. So to enable the local solutions that we need, Labour needs an answer to untangling and devolving the powers that deliver change, be that at a CA or a council level. So overall, both the government and our own party has to recognise that councils are empowered local decision makers. The only way to level up the economy, I believe, is to recognise that regional and local differences exist, and then to empower local government to act and address them in ways that work for the people there. The will and the skills are there in local government, but what we as local leaders lack are the powers and the resources to bring government departments and agencies together to deliver our locally determined and democratically accountable outcomes. And we don't win back red wall seats for Labour without offering a real, credible local alternative to the status quo in each place. And we don't offer that alternative without empowered and financed local decision making and action taking at the heart of that plan. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So now turning to Liam to talk more perhaps on some of those regionally devolved powers and the political implications of that.
Charlotte, thanks so much, and a big thanks to you and the CPP for organising this. For those watching, I've had the pleasure of working with Charlotte and the team at CPP for a couple of years as the co-chair of the all-party group on inclusive growth, and there's there's very few other places that are doing as much clear thinking about how we drive forward new indices that measure inclusive growth, and new thinking about the way in which local leaders can really use the powers and resources that they've got to try and bring more inclusive growth to their areas. And I think on this agenda around levelling up, some of the work, Charlotte, that you've published over the last few months has just been absolutely fantastic, and it's well worth anyone who's interested in this agenda taking a good look at that. So that's a brilliant presentation from Bridget and Henri. I just want to bring a couple of different angles to it, I suppose, informed by a lot of the thinking back that I've had to do as someone who was in the last Labour government, about what we got right and what we got wrong. And so I think there's probably 3 points that I just want to add to what we've heard so far. I think the first is to recognise that, you know, when I was at university, the Berlin Wall was just coming down, and the model of globalisation that we had included a number of pretty significant mistakes. So I think we felt in Labour at the time that trade and technology were pretty much unalloyed forces for good. We were able to deliver an extraordinary level of employment and economic growth during the New Labour years. But the reality is that we felt that education was the way that we safeguarded against rising inequality in those forces, against those forces that globalization was unlocking. And, you know, if you believe in Joseph Schumpeter, you would have been much more alive to the risks of oligopoly, which we now see dominating the global economy. If you're an advocate of Thomas Piketty, you would be much more alive to the risks of great concentrations of capital building up that returns a yield that is much bigger than the rate of economic growth. Or if you're a devotee of Joseph Stiglitz, you'd have been much more alert to the rules of the economic system, basically privileging a lucky few at the expense of everybody else, which is a long way of saying that as we now enter a period of deglobalization, which is, I think, what we're going to see a fair bit of over the next few years, there's a chance for the left to actually rethink how we re-globalize better. And certainly what we want to try and pioneer in the West Midlands is an approach that is now well understood and well recommended by a new generation of economists that is really focused on the role of local institutions. People now understand that institutions are the key to whether you have good economic growth or bad economic growth, or what economists like James Robson call extractive economic growth, the kind of economic growth that just goes to those at the top rather than to people more generally. And so as we began to think about the economic offer that we want to put front and centre in our politics here in the West Midlands, we realised that what we were doing is proposing a series of new institutions, you know, things like mayoral development corporations to help build thousands more green council homes, regional investment banks to help us mobilise investment in a completely new way, municipal or cooperative energy companies to help us kickstart renewable energy. We're proposing new institutions in precisely the same way that we did in 1870 and 1880 back here in Birmingham, when we pioneered something on George Street, actually just a stone's throw from the NIA, called the civic gospel. And the civic gospel is an idea that was really popularised by a preacher called George Dawson. He was a very charismatic preacher in Birmingham. He had 12 councillors in his congregation. He had many more, but there were 12 councillors there. 6 of them went on to become Lord Mayor, including somebody called Joseph Chamberlain. And Chamberlain turned that idea of the civic gospel into what we now know as municipal socialism. And it entailed the creation of a whole series of economic institutions that made sure that the invisible hand of the market was supplemented by the visible hand of the public authority actually helping make shit happen. Now, the third point really I wanted to leave you with is that we have now been thinking through how that economic theory goes on the back of leaflets and helps me get elected as Metro Mayor for the biggest mayoralty outside London next year. And what is really interesting is that 3 core ideas are basically now emerging. And as Bridget said, at the absolute core of people's ambitions here is a safe, secure, robust way for us to decarbonise. Now, we want to become the first net zero carbon city region in the country. But the reality is that people are really worried that we have to recover first and then go green. So people feel that green is more expensive, that we may need to get back on our feet and then think about going net zero carbon. And they don't feel very uncomfortable. They don't feel very comfortable about that dilemma, actually. They feel like they're kicking the can down the road. That dilemma dissolves when you put the lens of green manufacturing in front of people. And so the reason that we brought Annalisa Dodds to LEVC, the electric taxi company just outside Coventry last week, is to make that point, that we have the potential here in our region to become Britain's capital of green manufacturing, the place where we invent and deliver the technologies that the world needs to cut carbon emissions. We led the carbon revolution a couple of hundred years ago. We now want to lead the zero carbon revolution. And we can do that by becoming the green manufacturing capital in a way that creates good jobs for our young people. But that will only succeed if we, alongside that project, rebuild local ladders for our young people. People are so worried now about the prospects for our young people. And, you know, not surprised, I just got off the phone from one of my head teachers in Allen Rock this morning. You know, she's talking about having to send whole bubbles and year groups home to environments where 30% do not have any access to technology. And even if they have a laptop, they don't have Wi-Fi, and they certainly don't have a printer. So she now sees just a generation of children who are living in deprived families falling further and further and further behind. And people are now really worried that this incredible generation now coming up through our schools is going to graduate into an economic wasteland. So we have got to do so many different things to create new opportunities for young people, whether that's putting youth workers back in our neighbourhoods, whether it is rebuilding mental health services for young people, creating new tracks to earn while you learn degrees. There's a whole kind of agenda around young people that we've got to pioneer. And then finally, we will only achieve any of that if we carry on sticking together. You know, if people think that there's one silver lining over the last 6 months, it's the way that communities have come together to help each other out. Communities that stick together are safer and stronger. And the reason that we brought Keir Starmer to the Bestcott Stadium in Walsall on Saturday is to make that point. Anchor institutions in our communities, like our football clubs, our markets, our community groups. That is where the soul of the Labour Party was born. If you look at, you know, great books like, you know, Attlee's book, The Social Worker, the point that he makes is that if you're a socialist, you believe in society and you therefore believe in community building. And we are the community party. So actually, there is a new agenda that I think is married to a pretty clear economic philosophy that is a big opportunity for our economics and our politics. And we're going to test it and win with it in the Metro Mayor election here in the West Midlands next year. And we'd love your help in doing that.
Fantastic, thank you, Liam. So lots of themes that we're picking up in the course of those contributions. So what's Labour's credible alternative? What role do local institutions play? How do we make sure that we don't go out to the electorate talking about the local institutions? There needs to be a doorstep pitch to the ideas around inclusive growth and levelling up. And some of that might be around language, and it was interesting to hear, you know, jobs being prioritised early this week, and thinking about how that plays into the levelling agenda might be a key, particularly as we're unfortunately likely to see more of those job losses over the next few months. So against that backdrop, turning last but certainly no means least to Yvette to reflect on how Labour can win back the red wall, whether it can happen soon, is Brexit the elephant in the room, and what is Labour's credible alternative on levelling up and in restoring its traditional working class base. So over to you, Yvette.
Thank you, Charlotte, thank you. 2019 election feels like an incredibly long time ago now, with the crisis that we've all been through and are still going through even since. The fact that we are even just having to hold all of these fringe meetings and these events online, with all of the debates we would have been happening in person, although I guess if we'd all gone out grouse shooting, we could have met in person, perhaps, to have this discussion. But it was a traumatic election for the Labour Party because we lost votes everywhere, but we lost them most in the places where our party was founded and where we started, the industrial towns of the Midlands and the North. We lost working class votes, we lost older voters, we lost people who we should have been standing up for and have always been the party that hopes to represent. And we started before the COVID crisis began, we started to have those debates about all of the things that contributed to that, undoubtedly Brexit as part of that, undoubtedly the way our leadership was seen as part of that, but also undoubtedly long-term things that have been happening for many years that Brexit and our leadership put on steroids in terms of the way in which the Labour Party was perceived. And I don't think that this is really about actually winning back votes. Is about earning back people's trust and support, and that is rolling up our sleeves to do that, because it is the hard graft that needs to be done. And I think that's what we've seen from Cllr and Angela, being ready to travel the country virtually as well as physically, talking to people, listening to people, and being ready to earn back that support. I think there's two things I want to highlight. Is what's been the economic challenge and the economic issues facing some of the Red Wall constituencies, and then some of the political and social values issues, because actually I think that the way we have to respond to the COVID crisis should also teach us some lessons about how we have to set out ambitions for the country going forward as well. Economically, the places, many of the towns that we lost, and they were towns, this was particularly towns where we lost votes. The towns that we lost were also the places that had been the hardest hit by the combination of austerity and globalisation and automation over time as well. Both public and private sector changes that had hit some of our towns hard. We'd seen jobs grow in the cities, but jobs disappear from towns. The challenges for places, for industrial towns once their manufacturing goes, for seaside towns once the holiday makers go, for market towns once people start shopping online or head into the big shopping centres elsewhere. And the good jobs were being created far away, and the graduate jobs being created far away. So for parents saying to their children, for your best chance of getting a good job is to become a long-term commuter or to move further away from home. And Labour didn't seem to be providing an optimistic answer to that. What the Tories offered, what they tried to offer was optimism and change, and Labour didn't have a credible answer at the last election. And our economic vision for the future has to be both radical and credible, to have both that change vision, but also to be credible enough to persuade people to support it. On the political and social side, I think we were seen as a liberal party focused on younger, liberal, middle-class voters in cities, but drifting away from older, working class and more communitarian voters in towns, seen as unpatriotic, seen as not loving our country. And sometimes that is seen as being liberal rather than authoritarian, but it's missing out a whole communitarian tradition that has been part of the Labour movement for very many generations. So if you think about when we have won strongly in elections, so in 1945, for example, we drew on both our liberal and communitarian traditions as part of that 1945 victory and that 1945 government. We were both patriotic and internationalist. We were radical, and we were building things like a national health service that were very rooted in communities. We think of 1997, we were tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime. We were drawing on both the liberal communitarian traditions as well there. So where do we go from here, and how do we respond both to the challenges from the 2019 election, which we've not yet resolved, but also the COVID crisis, which is upending everything and creating new crises, new challenges for our country as well. There is a real risk that the places that were already having a tough time end up also getting hardest hit by the COVID crisis, because there's less resilience, because there's less diversity in the kinds of jobs and the kinds of industries and businesses that are there and that can grow. There's a serious risk too that those who are with the fewest qualifications also end up being hit hardest by the combination of the COVID crisis and the way in which the economy responds. And what the Tories offer is very much a national approach, which is also all based around, you can see it whether in their public health approach or in their economic approach, has been around big contracts and big private sector contracts, rather than recognising the different challenges by different places. You've seen it in their testing and tracing scheme, where they've gone heavy for the national contracts with big Deloitte and big private sector companies, rather than drawing on our local public health infrastructure, our local council infrastructure. But I think we're also starting to see it with, at the moment, they're in danger of making big mistakes with the Kickstart scheme, which is supposed to help young unemployed through this crisis, where it's built on, supposedly following the ideas that we had with the Future Jobs Fund back before the financial crisis. With the Future Jobs Fund, we had a guarantee that there would be guaranteed jobs or training for every young unemployed person in every community in the country. So we had to use local partnerships to make sure that those jobs were being delivered. We worked closely with local councils, with local job centres, with local networks of community and voluntary sector, because we'd guaranteed that there would be places that in every single community. Instead, at the moment, the government's Kickstart scheme seems to be relying on big national contracts and not making sure that there will definitely be the jobs in Castleford or in Pontefract or in Blackburn or every part of the country where they are most needed. And I think that should be a lesson to us about also what we need to do, and to make sure that our economic ideas are very much rooted in places, in towns, in making sure that those towns can restore that economic opportunity and future and opportunities to be proud of as well. And to learn as well from actually being back rooted in our communities in the way that we've had to be to respond to the coronavirus crisis. These are the things that we have always in the Labour Party done, but we have not championed them enough and not celebrated them enough. I've seen the work that Liam has done across the West Midlands, who's been working with community projects across the West Midlands to support people through the coronavirus crisis. We've had in Queen's Mill in Castleford, which is a community built, it's the old flour mill that the community has taken over. And we had some of our Labour Party members were actually providing phenomenal support for the local community, including activity packs delivered to young people across our towns. We've delivered, between us and with the network of volunteers we built up, 10,000 activity packs for children and teenagers across Castleford while schools were closed. And we set up a community book scheme, getting donations in from families with older kids, and we were delivering the books free to children when they were at home during the crisis as well. And that kind of community strength, it was exactly the same spirit, and actually some people were exactly the same people who had been doing all of the work to support the community during the miners' strike back in the 80s, who were part of those same community networks and part of those community networks again now. So those values, which have been some of the strengths of the way in which people have responded to the coronavirus crisis, are actually also values that have always been at the heart of the Labour Party. So for me, it's about making sure we celebrate those community values, and also how we build on that local economic strength and those local economic visions that we have. Those, I think, will be key parts of how we rebuild the Labour Party across the places that we lost.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Yvette. So I'm going to come to you and Henri for a first set of follow-up questions. Sarah's going to be fielding other questions in the Q&A function. So I guess just to provoke a little bit, how can the Labour Party sort of outplay the Conservatives on what they might see as their own community and family-oriented agenda and approach to achieving the same kinds of ends if looked through a levelling up lens? And then the other question is around Brexit, and how can Labour sort of turn that delivery of Brexit, whatever the outcome, to its advantage? So how can it maybe use it as a way to show that it really means what it says when you think about this communitarian approach rather than a kind of young liberal middle class agenda, which is very closely associated with Remain? So Yvette, first to you and then to Henri on those 2 points.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute and failing. So I think the community tradition has always been part of who we are. We've always combined the two, and you know, just if you see this as a polarisation and that you have to choose between liberal and communitarian, you have to choose between young and old, you have to choose between city and town, then you just allow our country to become more and more fractured and more divided. And when we have been at our strongest, we, the Labour Party, the Labour movement, have been about pulling everybody together and pulling together people from different perspectives, different views, and finding new ways to do that. So I think, and we've also always done it in a distinctive Labour way as well. It's always been a sort of inclusive and compassionate and supportive way, not in a way that was judgmental and pushing people away. And, you know, if you're not in the in crowd, then, or, you know, the sort of what I see as being some of the approach that the Conservatives take, it's one rule for those who are in power, it's another for everyone else. We've always had that fairness as part of our communitarian values, and that's what I think we need to strongly do. I think that is what Cllr has been doing when he's been talking about fairness, about everything from when you talk about, well, you know, you can't clap key workers and then ignore them and just leave them to be paid some of the worst pay in the country. If you think about the way social care workers who aren't even paid the living wage across the country. So I think you can embed fairness in that. I think in terms of the Brexit, look, the government is going to deliver Brexit. They have to get on with it, as Cllr has said. And oh, I've lost my sorry. They have to get on with it, as Cllr has said, and they have to deliver on the promises they made to make sure that that will work for our manufacturing industry across the country. Actually, I think for most people across the country, what they want to see is people responding to the coronavirus crisis and not to be, you know, reopening the old debates that we had last year and we had the year before.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Henri, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, and I think it's really interesting, isn't it, to look at some of Liam's fellow candidates who've been now elected for 3.5 years from the Labour Party. So Steve and Andy in the north of England have probably been making loads of strides actually in trying to reconcile what a pro-business, pro-workers' rights, pro-growth agenda looks like in practice, and resolving tensions that had existed for a long time in how the Labour Party responds to the need to secure high levels of growth, but then share those benefits more widely. And the previous leadership of the Labour Party wasn't even interested in having anything to do with those insights, right? So the kind of the reality, isn't it, is that there are people out there doing real things that are reminding people what the Labour Party was set up to do. And as someone whose history was in local government, like one of our fellow panellists, I think the tradition of municipal socialism, which Liam mentioned in his remarks, I think is alive and well in the Labour Party. And that kind of rooting of practical change and political principle together with a sort of a kind of firm sense of kind of practicality in particular, and a lack of airy-fairiness. And that's not a sort of a general kind of critique of Labour's front bench currently, but it definitely is one I would apply to the one before the election last year, in that it felt like a very childish, immature game some of the time. And that really did turn off people who have real problems, because it's all very well to go into communities and talk to middle-class voters about abstract issues, which they may have some care for. But when you're telling people whose lives are some of the most challenging in our society, that you're more interested in talking about issues that are peripheral to their lives than in things that really matter to them, then you're in real trouble. And I think that the response to Brexit and the impact of that is the taking control message, right? Which is that there are two elements of taking back control. There is what the Conservative Party said they were doing by leaving the European Union, or by the Leave campaign taking us out of the European Union. There is the contra about what that meant in places like Workington, that was such a focus during the election, and Workington man and woman, I would hasten to add to that formulation, because I think people there definitely wanted to take back control of their lives, but I'm not sure that leaving the European Union will achieve that. And so if someone can demonstrate what Labour's version of taking back control would mean in the lives of people in those sorts of communities, I think that's a very persuasive political project. And I think the fact that someone else has already promised to do it, and the central plank of that mission will potentially fall very short, I think is really powerful. And I think what was being said earlier in the conversation about how you spend the Shared Prosperity Fund, how you talk about what social solidarity means in a country that has such huge disparities in wealth and opportunity, I think is the start of what taking back control means. Because the way that your organisation, Charlotte, and your team thinks about economic problems is this isn't an abstract thing. You don't do levelling up to people, you don't do economic rebalancing. You have to find tools to enable communities and businesses and groups of workers affected by what's happened to our economy to feel a sense of ownership and direction over their own future. And I think that type of political project is a very interesting one. And it reminds me very much of pre-97, right, in some ways, which also was a very communitarian time in the Labour Party's history, but that was a more centralising approach. And there needs to be a decentralising version of that same narrative.
And that's exactly, thank you, Henri, where I wanted to take the conversation next, in coming back to Liam and Brigid, because Yvette talked about the need for both a radical and credible path. And I wonder, and this is picking on some of the comments in the chat, thanks to Richard and Shelley for your thoughts. How radical is this approach, Liam, particularly the kind of vision that you set out for the Labour Party? It doesn't necessarily always have the most local of track records. It hasn't necessarily sought to do what Henri was talking about in terms of taking back control for communities, despite its communitarian ethos. It still has had a very sort of central delivery, nationalisation approach to delivering policy. So your thoughts on that, and then to Brigid, please. As soon as we can unmute you. Hang on, Sarah, just you could do that, please, for Liam.
So these have always been, tensions in the Labour movement, as has been the tension between the communitarian and liberal, by the way. Yvette and I used to talk about this a lot at the end of the last Labour government, because, the truth is, the dark secret of communitarianism is that, there has been a tradition within it which defended the traditional at the expense of individual rights. And if you think about the energy with which new identity politics has brought to politics right now, sometimes those things are in tension. And there's an old phrase actually that John Rawls used to use, which is about trying to identify the overlapping consensus between different perspectives on public life and what is good and what isn't. And that is something that we as political leaders now need to be really, really very good at, because we come from communities. Actually, that is where you do best reconcile different perspectives on what is good and what is not good, what is right and what is virtuous. And you can't do that, or you do that very badly if you just work and live in the Palace of Westminster and work in Whitehall. But Yvette is right to say it is the tradition from which we were born. But you just can't, this is not just about kind of going back to the past. This is about remembering that tradition and being aware that you have to continue to reinvent it. And it's something that people have really recognised over the last 6 months. So, you know, when we go out and ask people about what they found was the silver lining in the last 6 months, that resurgence in community spirit is what people talk about. You know, so they talk about actually getting to know their neighbours when they go out and clap for carers on a Thursday night. They talk about the street-based WhatsApp groups, the street-based Facebook groups, the resurgence of mutual aid. So we've kind of shown people really vividly over the last 6 months that it's perfectly possible to reinvent community in communities that are more diverse at a time of crisis. And we have to surf that wave, I think, really think creatively and imaginatively about how we use culture and community work to sustain those kind of traditions, like those kind of instincts that have come to the fore. And, you know, that is often, as it happens, how Labour has reinvented itself in the past. So, you know, I often tell the story about how after Labour's catastrophic defeat in 1931, I think it's in 1933 that Herbert Murison is elected as leader of London County Council. And what you see over the course of the 1930s is Labour reinvent a municipal socialism in local government. And actually it's those ideas, those instincts that then inform so much of what we then did in 1945 and thereafter. And I think, you know, Henri is right to say, and Bridget kind of underlined this really, you know, what you're seeing good people in local government now do is invent new ways of doing things. And I am absolutely sure that those ideas will be what shapes the next Labour manifesto. And it's why, you know, having been in the cabinet, you know, I decided to run for Metro Mayor in the West Midlands, because I just think that these things are really very, very difficult to do in Westminster. Westminster is too unstable. It is too difficult to bring people together. The Whitehall structure locks you into turf wars, which are often incredibly intractable. Actually, it is just easier to get shit done at the local level. And what we want to do is, you know, help reinvent green municipal socialism in what we do here in the West Midlands. And through that work, help shape the future of our movement. That's the contribution that we want to make.
Fantastic, thank you, Liam. And finally, to Brigid, and I think any reflections you have on how you make the case for local will do things differently and do things better, but also sit within a national Labour Party that has a national identity and a national platform and clarity of a national policy programme. How do you square some of those tensions too? So over to you for your reflections.
Thanks. So one of the reasons my two arguments are about devolving powers and money, my arguments are in that space rather than the what should the politics space be, because unless we nail that and the ability to deliver, we're fighting the ground war here as councils with two hands tied behind our back and with none of the resources that we need, none of the ammunition that we need to make a difference. We've got kids going hungry around us. We've got social care waiting lists piling up. We've got homeless people, thankfully not on our streets right now, thanks to the Everybody In policy, but they've been there for the last 10 years. We have our black ethnic minority communities dying around us. We have institutions closing left, right and centre in our local areas, and as councils we've got this huge responsibility to deliver on all of those agendas, and people crying out to us to help, and we don't have, at the moment, we've got all the responsibility to deliver on changing that, but we don't have the powers we need to do it or the money that we need to do it. And unless we can unlock those two things, then it doesn't matter what our ideas are to an extent, because we don't have the powers to deliver on it. Within the party, the only place that Labour has held power in the last 10 years, the only people who have been in government in the last 10 years are local politicians and local councils. And to say that we've been sidelined by the party for the last 10 years is something of an understatement. There's been some fantastic work done through the LGA, through Nick Forbes in particular leading on this to get our voice heard more in the party. But if you look at the last manifesto process, councils were pretty much locked out of that. Ideas from local government were not being heard around the table. We had national leads on policy finding out completely unworkable policies, very often at the last minute, hours before they were about to be announced nationally. So we're here, we've got the experience, it's on a smaller scale, but it's there. It's not being heard. It's not being reflected at all up through the ranks at the moment to the extent that it needs to be. If we're going to start delivering on this stuff, we've got to fix our internal mechanisms for hearing councillors and our internal sort of respect levels for them, I think. We've got a tricky thing about holding to account the government whilst celebrating local government's delivery. So when you're going out there with an election message, it's kind of hard to go, we're a Labour local council, you've got a Tory national government, and putting the blame where it lies in those particular places. That's a really tricky message to get across on the doorstep, but it's one that we're all grappling with. But yeah, I'm very much in that slightly more basic space, which is unless we fix some of the real structural things that are holding local government back, we're not going to unleash any of the amazing things that Liam and Yvette are talking about, and we're just not in a space to sort of implement some of that stuff.
Okay, thank you, Bridget. Well, I think that's a good place to start wrapping up. Tomorrow we will cover some of the more detailed policy, and the first of which, and something that CPP published research on a few months ago, and Cllr used at the dispatch box at PMQs, which was nice, was on the role of local government financing and the need to shore up before we level up, as we put it. So that will be tomorrow. But I think the takeaways from today is that we need a credible alternative, one that chimes with people, one that speaks to their experiences and really shows a way into how the party will deliver for them and their communities. We've heard a lot around the role that green can play and must play, so that we're not just thinking about the social and economic outcomes, but also the environmental outcomes as well. And I think it's fair to say that the scale of the challenge for the party is considerable. As Henri highlighted, you know, the electoral maths are very challenging indeed, but putting in place the array of ideas that have come out from today's discussion and more might just be the beginning of the turnaround that I'm sure everyone in the party would wish to see. And from CPP's perspective, we are a non-partisan think tank. We are just absolutely invested in identifying practical ways to further what we call the inclusive growth agenda that cuts across the full spectrum of everything we've been talking about today. So any help that we can be to you and your colleagues, then do get in touch and let us know. So here we will close, but for anyone who wants to stay around, we will be hosting a policy clinic now, covering health inequalities, skills and devolution over the next hour or so. So do please stay on the line for that. Otherwise, we look forward to speaking with you over the next few days and thereafter. Many thanks again to our panellists, Henri, Liam, Yvette and Brigid. Thank you very much, everyone.
Or joining us for this CPP policy clinic. It's the first time we've run such a thing, and the purpose of it is to really get into the delivery of the levelling up agenda. As Charlotte said, I'm head of policy at CPP and will be chairing today's session. And the way it's going to work is that over the next sort of 45 minutes, we're going to do 3 separate sessions. One on health inequalities by place, one on skills, and one on devolution. Each one will have a 5-minute presentation by one of our CPP in-house experts, and then we have 10 minutes on each subject to discuss between us. So really welcome your questions in the chat as we go, and we can start a bit of a debate on on some of these key drivers of the Levelling Up agenda. So for those of you who've just joined us, the Centre for Progressive Policy, we're a think tank working to deliver inclusive growth across the UK. And of course, now this has kind of been neatly coined the Levelling Up agenda by the current government. And so very much we're focused on the inequalities that are faced across the UK, not just the economic inequalities in income and wealth, but also the wider set of policies that we know are so critical: health, skills, local leadership and accountability, and education. And those will be some of the things we're exploring today. Now, the Levelling Up agenda has, whilst it's been sort of coined by the current government as that, it's been a long-standing issue that the Labour Party has talked about, whether that's looking at the development of regional policy and regional agencies, or whether that's focusing on education. All of these are key drivers in reducing the gap between the South East and the rest of the UK. COVID, of course, has shone a light on many of these critical issues, and it's also made some of them worse. And what's more, we've seen the interdependency between the economic and what's also classed as the social merge. We've seen that without a healthy population, we cannot succeed economically. So this interconnection of health policy, social policy, and economic policy is something that we at CPP see as critical to tackling place-based inequalities. Quick housekeeping. As we say, this is a session open to all Labour members. We've particularly invited councillors from across the UK to join us with this policy clinic. And if there are any kind of examples or case studies you'd like to kind of come on and tell us about along the way, we'd love to hear from you. We're recording the session and may well use it on separate channels after the event. And if you'd like to tweet about us, we're #CPPLevelUp. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Ben Franklin, who is our Head of Research at CPP, and he'll be taking you through some of our work that we've done on health inequalities before we open up to question and discussion. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks very much. Hopefully you can hear me okay. That's good. Thank you very much. Zara, would you mind putting on the slide for everyone to see if possible? Well, while Sarah's doing that, I think it's worthwhile saying, obviously health is such a crucial block for everything at this moment in time, and forever was, but it's particularly so given COVID has kind of exacerbated all of these issues that we've seen with health over many years. So the table in front of you is from our recent report on public health and obesity, and it's just a really clear indication of often called the social gradient of health, so showing how health outcomes are so much worse for poorer people than well-off people. And what we've got in there is the mortality rate, both from COVID and all causes of death. And this is the kind of first peak of the pandemic. And then there's a section on health behaviours that you can see. And then there's a section on access to healthy or unhealthy food. And what this table does is kind of illustrate the real challenges there are across the different economic deciles of the UK. So you can see, for instance, that in the most deprived decile, the COVID mortality rate was around 140 per 100,000, whereas amongst the least deprived decile, it was only 63. And that carries all the way through this table. So you look at fast food outlets, for example, per 100,000 people. In the most deprived, it's around 130 outlets per 100,000. In the least deprived, it's around 61. So it really does show some of the issues in a nutshell that we are dealing with. And I know early on in this crisis, people said, well, COVID is going to be experienced equally by everyone. Well, clearly it wasn't. And I don't think that came as any surprise to public health specialists or people who've looked at some of these issues in any great detail. I think what's interesting about the government's response is it's been all about the NHS and pumping as much money into the NHS as possible. And NHS, brilliant, absolutely a brilliant organisation. and it's kind of it's a political hot potato, as it were, and it is a critical factor in determining places' health. But at the same time, the vast majority of health is determined by other factors, and that deprivation table, as I showed there, really demonstrates that quite clearly. And ultimately, one of the arguments that we've made in our work is that throwing money at the NHS and nothing else is potentially a false economy in the long run as well. Now, I should say that even prior to COVID, the healthy life expectancy gap was absolutely immense. So you're talking about something like 19 years in healthy life expectancy between the most and least deprived places. And that's absolutely astonishing. And in our work looking at inclusive economic growth and trying to measure it, it was this aspect of health that was such a key driver in trying to untangle and explain economic inequalities across local areas. So it goes back to what Zoe was saying about this kind of inherent link between social and economic on one side and the health on the other as well. Now, as we know, obesity has come front and centre, partly because people who have been overweight are slightly more, well, significantly more at risk of COVID than those who aren't. And the government have started to look at measures to address this. But I think obesity is a really good example of going beyond the NHS, which is particularly important at this moment in time. And so what we've argued for at the CPP is really a whole of government approach to this. So not just banning TV adverts, so that might be a decent start, but it's about addressing all sorts of social and economic and environmental problems that help to determine whether someone's more or less likely to become obese. So that might be, planning restrictions on fast food outlets, but it might also be, and really importantly, and something we think the government have missed quite significantly, which is around the price of healthy food. And we have outlined some measures to try and deal with that in our recent report in October, which include the Healthy Family Voucher, trying to make that more accessible. And there is now a drive on that, thanks to Marcus Rashford and others too, to try and improve on the accessibility of healthy food, which is really important, but not necessarily something government have seen as part of its obesity agenda, although it is being linked to food security agenda, which is interesting. And I think more linkages between those two would be really important. And then another intervention that we've argued strongly for, not just in terms of obesity and childhood obesity, but a lot more longer term health prevention and promotion within places, is around Sure Start, and how we've seen a significant decline in the number of Sure Starts in local areas over many years as a result of the end of funding for it under the previous Tory party. And that's really short-sighted. Recent evaluations of Sure Start have shown that it's been extremely successful in improving health outcomes, particularly in deprived places. So I realise I'm only got 5 minutes, so I'll be quick. But it's really, I think the crucial takeaway here is that, as ever, prevention is better than cure. But unfortunately, the NHS with its focus on curing still retains this real potency, and that's important because it's great for what it is, but it is only one very small part of addressing the nation's health. There was a recent University of York paper that showed expenditure on the local public health grant, for example, is 3.5 times more productive than healthcare. So that really goes to show this point around prevention is better than cure, and trying to embed prevention within all layers of government, both national and local. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That's great and gives us a really good insight into some of the areas that we're focusing on as an organisation. I just wonder if I could just ask you some follow-up questions to that, and also welcome any questions that people would like to add into the chat at the side, and I'll pick up on those too. But whilst we're waiting for those to come in, I suppose, as you say, we've got the NHS and the critical area of policy, especially for the Labour Party, as a national service, and at the same time we have the kind of prevention bit of health sitting locally. I mean, is this all a question of money? Are we just saying, well, if local health prevention had more money, it would do better and that's what we need, or is there something else in addition to that?
So yes, so I think there is definitely an efficiency argument in this as well. So, you know, the latest Office for Budget Responsibility report, you know, it shows that health spending as a proportion of GDP is going to rise, partly because of demographics, but also technological change as well. And that the current rise essentially drives our debt to GDP to around 200% by 2050, which, you know, is unsustainable. And particularly when you consider that life expectancy is stalling and healthy life expectancy differences are widening. So there's a real inefficiency argument in all of this. And yes, of course, the NHS is really important, but we need to be able to prevent people from needing to go to the NHS as much as they do. So, you know, can we kind of compress morbidity rather than what we're seeing at the moment is of an expansion of it, which is ultimately putting more pressure on the health service. And that's why these kind of prevention measures are necessary, which includes properly funding local government finances, which includes properly funding the local public health grant. And one of the things we do advocate for is actually in our report from last year, that is trying to get to a bit better understanding of, well, what is most important for our nation's health? Is it actually that we should put more money in education, because it's early years and education that's so important in determining childhood outcomes and childhood health that then leads into adult health, rather than just putting more and more money into the NHS, as it were, as well over time. So I think your points are absolutely right, and I think you can do more on the kind of understanding what's the most efficient kind of allocation of resources in order to drive health improvements over time.
Brilliant. And just again, picking up on the obesity point that you raised, because I know that's something that you've kind of personally done a lot of work into. I suppose if we're thinking politically about this, there's sort of, in my mind, two things going on here. So firstly, you know, helping prevent obesity, you could say, is squarely prevention, and stopping those cases of diabetes and all the related symptoms going into the NHS and putting on pressure on the NHS later. So firstly, you know, is this just central government wading in where local government should be stepping up, is essentially my question. And then secondly, there's a sort of very political sort of personal choice versus state intervention point here, I would think, where, you know, traditionally the government, the Conservative Party, would like to think that, you know, people should be left to their own choices and this is just nanny state. Whereas in actual fact, you know, we do see a renewed emphasis even from the Conservative government on obesity, for example, and all those debates that have been had on the sugar tax and whether that's a good thing or not. So 2 points just on obesity, as I say, the kind of balance between central and local, and secondly, is this nanny state or is this really necessary?
Well, I think on your first point, it has to be both. I think there has to be action that's taken at a central government, from a central government point of view as well. And actually, we've been calling for a sort of health inequalities strategy, which doesn't just look at obesity, but looks at health inequalities in the round and seeks to work out ways to address those. If you're thinking, for example, about the local public health grant, then that also comes from the allocation of resources that comes centrally as well. So that's definitely a question for central government, I think. But clearly, local government is really powerful in this sense as well. In terms of, I mean, earlier in the table, for example, we looked at fast food, the amount of fast food restaurants per 1,000 people across local authorities, and clearly in those deprived places, you're seeing a greater density of fast food outlets, and that's clearly something that planning and local government can deal with. Recently, in my local area, which is a relatively poor area of southeast London, they closed the local pharmacy where people would always be queuing outside with Zimmer frames and all the rest of it. And that can clearly be something that local government can do something about, instead of having people to ship themselves down to a local, more affluent area to use the pharmacy there too. So there's a lot that local government can do. And then there's obviously the question about green spaces, etc. And clearly, local government's finance has been severely restricted. So there's a resource constraint in that sense. There are things they can do for sure.
Brilliant, thank you. We've actually just had a question in the chat from Anthony Smith. Thank you, Anthony. So his question is about public health functions not only responding to emergencies, but prevention across the board, linking together everything from early years to education, family support, mental health and social care, which I think is a kind of view that as CPP would absolutely endorse. I suppose the thrust of his question is really, you know, if prevention cuts across all of these areas, how can we make that a manageable thing at local level to improve?
Yeah, and of course there's big question marks with the end of Public Health England here as well, and there's a question at a national level about, well, what is public health? You know, is it just about epidemiology and vaccinations, which we would certainly say it isn't. It goes much deeper than that, and actually local government is absolutely the front line on this, and directors of public health are really important in this sense as well. And for some of the work that we did last year, you know, there is clearly a postcode lottery in terms of how well public health directors are embedded within their local areas, you know, because clearly economic policy and economic planning should be involving health and vice versa as much as possible, so that the two things speak to one another, and so that you get as much. For example, if your local big employer is targeting deprived communities for their good jobs, that's a really good outcome that the local authority can be part of. So it's absolutely right. It's a really good question, and I think that both nationally and locally we can be doing more on this to try and join the dots up and think just beyond narrow definitions of health that we've used in the past.
We've had another question just come in on the institutions, the overlapping institutions that work in the health space. So of course, we've just had Public Health England, as was, given that the government's taken a move to decide to close that. Local trusts, NHS England. Do we think this kind of institutional setup is fine as it is, or does it need radical change?
Well, it's an easy one to answer, that it probably needs change, simplification, but how you actually do it in a way that is meaningful and supportive of something better, I'm not sure. What I do think, though, is that we can be stronger on who is accountable ultimately for population health. Because at the moment we have a Secretary of State who is it's about COVID, obviously firefighting COVID, but it's also about waiting lists and waiting times in hospitals. We've got combined authorities where some mayors are more readily able to take on board that responsibility for health than others. So I think it's trying to be as clear as possible at what levels are the people who are responsible for population health, as distinct from the waiting list stuff which sits within the NHS. Now, if that doesn't really sit within the NHS, then the NHS needs to change and be more of a prevention service than it is at the moment, which is very much a curing service and looking after older people, and it will increasingly be that.
Yeah, and another really excellent question from Diane Peacock, who's asked about, should we be rethinking the role and relationship between secondary care hospitals, primary and community care, and public health, given that, since the setup of the NHS, there's been great medical advances as well as demographic changes and local health inequalities. I think that's a really, massive question, Diane, but I think actually that really gets to the nub of the issue here about how you integrate the various players in the healthcare system. Have you got any thoughts on that, Ben?
Absolutely right, and clearly, social. If something happens from this crisis in terms of social care, that would be a great step forward. I mean, it has been an absolute tragedy in the making for many years, and there are also unintended consequences of not sorting the social care system out in terms of the economic impact it has on people who now have to be family caregivers as well. So absolutely, there needs to be institutional reform of social care. There has been some talk about renationalising of it, although there are quite difficult questions about the responsibilities of state versus individual, especially people who have high degrees of wealth, etc. But the vast majority of people who are in care homes don't actually have that much by way of wealth in any case. So clearly, social care is a big one, and I think COVID has at least made that much more of a pressing issue, even if the government haven't got time right now to find a resolution for it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ben. That brings us to the end of our health section. But to those who are with us watching, and in particular to Anthony and Diane with their excellent questions, if there are ideas you'd like to engage with us on, please do get in touch with us at CPP. Our kind of generic email address is info@progressive-policy.net, but you can also find us on Twitter, and we'd really be up for continuing these conversations, really critical policy conversations, and drawing on any expertise you may have. So thanks again, thank you to Ben, thank you for our great questions. And now we are going to move over to Andy Norman, who is a research analyst at CPP and a specialist on the skills agenda. So again, we're going to start with a short presentation followed by Q&A from the audience. Andy, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zoe. And I hope everybody can hear me okay. It's quite warm in here and my laptop sounds like it's about to take off. But let's see how we go. So skills, let's go back to before COVID times and just try and remember what kind of state the skills system was in those crazy days in February earlier this year when the whole world hadn't changed. Three key challenges, I think, at that point for the skills system. The first won't be a big surprise to anybody, but huge falls in participation and investment. Participation in publicly funded skills courses has decreased by 37% in recent years. And total spending on adult education and skills is down 39%. So both huge falls in recent years. Second key challenge, I think, is there's a real inequality in who's participating in skills training. One of my favorite statistics to quote on this is that those with a master's degree are 3 times more likely to receive work-related training than those without GCSEs. So the big danger here is that the skills system is exacerbating these existing inequalities in who's doing training. If you're already well trained, you're likely to get even more training, basically. Big problem. And the third key challenge facing the skills system is this place-based inequality in skills. So we've done some number crunching on this, and compared to the rest of England, people in the former red wall are less likely to be qualified to a level 4 or above. They're more likely not to have any kind of formal qualification, and they're also less likely to receive training from their employer. So going into the crisis, we had this big drop in participation, big drop in investment, and trends that were already exacerbating existing inequalities. And it won't come as a massive surprise to you if I say that COVID-19 has made these things worse. We all know this big projection of unemployment that's coming our way, and the challenges that all businesses are facing at the moment. And that means that training is going to be more important than ever in the future as we try to recover from COVID-19. But many businesses are, as I say, really struggling financially. And so private investment in training is almost certain to fall. And just as we've seen in the jobs data, this is likely to fall on the shoulders of the young and people in low-wage jobs. We can start to see this in the apprenticeship data that's been released since the outbreak of COVID-19. The most alarming statistic is that apprenticeship starts for young people under the age of 19 has fallen by 68% since the outbreak of the crisis. And can you imagine if university places had fallen by 68%, the kind of outcry that we'd be facing? Well, it's just as important that we rectify this huge fall in opportunities to train and learn for young people in technical education. And for some sectors, you look at the sectoral breakdown of the data, and for travel and tourism is a fall of about 99%. So almost all opportunities for apprenticeships there have gone, and it's similar for other sectors as well. We're yet to see any kind of decent data on the effects of training by region, but it's likely that it's going to follow the same patterns that we've seen CPP research from earlier in the year suggests that the former Red Wall will be hit hardest in an economic sense. And if I had to guess, I would say that's going to be the similar fact for training opportunities. So all of this means that an inclusive recovery is in jeopardy unless we get to grips with these skills challenges. These trends started before COVID-19, but the outbreak is absolutely exacerbating them. So that's the problem. What's the solution? We published a report earlier in the summer that called for a turbocharged right to retrain. And this is really to deal with the fact that we have a choice for people who are currently furloughed. In 6 months' time, do we want them to be starting out a long period of unemployment, or do we want them to be training to get into the new jobs of the future? Obviously, it's the latter. But for that to be achieved, we need to make some really big decisions, and we need to be incredibly ambitious for our skills system. So this means, first and foremost, capitalizing, I think, on the momentum there is for online learning now. And that means building an online high quality learning system. There's been a little bit of progress on this, but not nearly enough. Government must go much further. We also need to step in terms of public funding where the private sector is going to pull back. And that, first and foremost, means what we're calling for a 50% wage subsidy for young apprentices. The government announced a £2,000 bonus for any employer taking on a young apprentice. That's a start, but that's only about 13% of wages for a year. And that's not enough to change employers' decisions. So we need a 50% wage subsidy. We also need a learner's living allowance so that if you're undertaking training, you have access to the same kind of maintenance allowance that if you were doing higher education. And we also need to ramp up local strategic input. We need to understand that local areas know their skill systems, they know their economies, and we need to empower them to be able to drive forward positive change. So that's what I think we should be doing. That's what CPP thinks we should be doing. There is lots of evidence that training programs can be really effective at moving people into good jobs. There's a wealth of evidence from the US that suggests that if you do it properly, if you have strong organizational capacity of the programs, if you have strong links to local employers, then these programs can be good at getting people into the jobs that they want in the future. But it needs to be funded properly, and it needs to be taken seriously by policymakers. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to any questions that anybody has.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy. As ever, I will kick off with some questions, and then I invite anybody else to put further questions in the chat as we go along. My first question, Andy, is just picking up on, so the skills system is massive, right? So we're talking under 19 sort of, and that includes basic skills as well as those high level skills. We're talking about the FE system supporting adult learners. And that might be with their basic skills, but also again, it might be with anything from apprenticeship degree level upwards. And we're also talking about progression in the workplace.
Yeah.
So thinking of the kind of the levelling up agenda in the UK, if you had to sort of choose where you'd put your money, sorry, this is a slightly cruel question, because obviously, you know, we want all parts of the skills system to have a boost, but where do you think gets the sort of, where should we be putting investment as a priority out of that list in order to help level up the skills of people across the country?
That's a good question. And I would say, you know, we have to do something about the 68% fall for starts for young apprentices. Even for older apprentices, it's about 45% down. And apprenticeships have been shown to be incredibly effective if you get the quality right. For example, a level 3, if you do a level 3 apprenticeship in engineering, you on average go on to earn more than if you do engineering at university. So these are really high quality routes that can take people into the labour market and really set them up well for the future. And what's also worrying in the apprenticeship data is that the biggest falls have been seen at level 2. So it's this first step onto the training ladder that has pretty much disappeared, and is often used in the past for young people as their first step into a well-paid technical career. So what we're seeing COVID particularly, and it started before as well, but particularly now, is this first step of the ladder removed for young people. So in terms of driving inclusive growth across the country, unless we are able to persuade firms to then take on, again, young apprentices at lower levels and progress them through, we're going to see a kind of exacerbation of what we're talking about with a K-shaped recovery, where if you're already highly skilled, already in a good job, you're fine, you'll save up lots of money over lockdown and come out of it being able to, boast of your savings. But if you're a young person who's looking for their first step onto the skills ladder and the technical education ladder, at the moment it's looking pretty bleak. So we need really big action on that. As I said, at least a 50% wage subsidy for young apprentices would be, if I was Gillian Keegan, the skills minister right now, that would be top of my list.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've just had a question in from Anna Mowbray on the chat function, and she's asking a very CPP question. So I'm very pleased that we've received it, which is about the extent to which we think the skills system should be devolved locally to help achieve levelling up. And of course, we've seen the adult education budget be devolved in some areas to some combined authorities, but there's a whole new conversation, or a whole different conversation to be had about the skills system pre-adult. What's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. It's almost like we planted that question, isn't it? But perfect. Thanks very much, Anna. I think there are a number of things to consider here. Firstly, it sounds like a bit of a cliche to say, but it's a bit of a postcode lottery at the moment when it comes to your skills system. If you happen to live in a combined authority that has devolved adult education budget, you live in an area that is able to take a little bit of control over its skills system. But if you don't, then you're left to Westminster to make the decisions. Generally, I'm very much pro skills devolution. I think as a long run goal, having every area able to design local economic strategies and have a skills system that they can control to complement that should be the ultimate goal. It's all a question of how we get there, and I think it's an exciting time because, as you mentioned, we've got the metro mayors and the combined authorities who now have control of the adult education budget, and it's really up to them to show that it can work. But I also do feel for the metro mayors, because it's the adult education budget has been slashed in recent years, and they still don't, even over this smaller adult education budget, they still don't have full control. So it's like trying to prove something works with both of their hands tied behind their backs. So give the mayors proper devolution of adult education budget, boost the budget, let them show it can work, and then we can move on to other areas as well, other parts of the country, but also other parts of the skills system, I think.
Very good. And we've just had another question from Diane Peacock, asking about the link between the school curriculum and is that linked to the low take-up of level 2 skills courses. And I think this kind of is generally kind of taking a step back. That question's a very interesting one in terms of what advice kids get about what path they should take, whether they should be entering the skills system or whether they should be staying in the kind of traditional academic route. And I wonder if you had any reflections on that, Andy.
There were some suggestions that the way that schools are funded, particularly post-16, meant that they had a financial incentive to keep their young people onto their sixth form rather than, you know, encourage them to take up level 2 skills courses or level 3 skills courses in further education colleges. I don't know whether that's completely true, but you know, it's a reminder that we need a joined up education system where people are able to make decisions with a whole systems approach, so that we know what's best for young people. Is it to go and do a level 2 skills course? Is it to stay in school and do an A level? Is it to do an apprenticeship, and not have different parts of the skills of the education system competing with each other? This is going to be an issue in the run up to the FE white paper, because at the moment we have a system where further education colleges are competing with each other for students. But in my opinion, what you want in a sort of long run sense is to have all parts of the system working together collaboratively, to ensure that, you know, there's no kind of race to the bottom competition for learners, and we actually get to a point where the system can deliver what's best for each learner.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you for your questions from Anna and Diane, and thank you to Andy for giving us that insight into CPP's work and application at the local level. Skills, and particularly through the vocational system, is something that we at CPP are very passionate about and see it as totally central to the levelling up agenda. So again, if any of you online would like to engage with us further, please do get in touch. Again, do find us on Twitter at CenterProPolicy, #CPP Level Up. Please share your ideas, or if you'd like to take the discussion further, I'm sure Andy and colleagues will follow up with you later on. Thanks again, Andy. So now we are moving to our third and final session, which looks at the role of place and devolution in levelling up. So we have, I think, both Charlotte Aldrich, our director, and Dan Gardner, who is the lead of the Inclusive Growth Network, which is a new network we have started and host at CPP, a network of 12 local areas, combined authorities and local authorities across the UK committed to inclusive growth. May I pass over the mic to Team Devo? Thank you.
Thanks, Zoe. If you've been on in our expo booth since we kicked off at 2, you will have heard a lot about how CPP is really committed to understanding the nature, shape, distribution of our economy by looking through the lens of place. And all the work that we do in terms of developing policy recommendations are not only oriented to how we think about place-based responses, but how place-based responses can inform and shape the national framework as well, so that seeing the two go hand in hand. Otherwise, really, policymakers, and speaking as someone who used to be in Whitehall, often have a tendency to think about the economy as this abstract idea, the notion that we can if we just think hard enough, in Whitehall, we might be able to kind of increase productivity, again, as an abstract idea. And we know that that isn't actually how things work on the ground. And so if we're going to make a difference, we need to think about what it means for people and places and communities and jobs in real life. So place is our thing, and inclusive growth is what we're trying to achieve. And as a result, devolution is so crucial as a delivery mechanism and as part of that institution building that we've talked a lot about this afternoon. And that applies whether we're thinking around health and tackling health inequalities and joining up some of the different institutional divides that currently exist within and across the NHS and wider population health space, as much as it applies on the skills education agenda and pretty much every other kind of policy you can imagine. So I think that's the real opportunity of devolution and place-based policy, is to try and get some strategic policy making, some strategic coordination across typically travel to work areas. So we've seen the mayoral combined authorities created largely along that kind of footprint. I thought I'd just give you a very quick potted history of the shape of devolution, because there's so much path dependency in how institutions are set up, and there's so much path dependency in the point in time we are at the moment, which is hotly anticipating the devolution and local recovery white paper that many of you may have seen has been shifted from a September announcement to a CSR announcement to a sometime next year announcement. And actually that policy document has its origins in what was called the Devolution Framework, which Theresa May actually promised when she was campaigning in 2017 election. And that was to clear up what had preceded since 2010, which was in that year the abolition of the regional development agencies, the creation of LEPs, and the start of George Osborne's place-based devolution approach. It's interesting to reflect that before that time, before about 2014, we only used the word devolution with regards to at a national level. So we talked about Welsh, Scottish devolution, and now we talk about place-based devolution, and that's particularly, in fact, almost entirely an English aspect, an English thing. And we've seen in England city regions and counties to a very limited extent securing additional place-based devolved powers. And that came about, again, largely because of the impact of the previous recession in the 2008 financial crash. And it was really presented as a way of driving local economic growth. So it became the kind of main vehicle for thinking about local economic growth. And that's important because it meant that a lot of what was in supposedly bespoke devolved power deals, so we had growth deals, city deals, devolution deals, very oriented around traditional economic policy ideas. So there was a bit in there about transport, there was a bit in there about careers guidance, not that we saw anything about it happen as a result, but anyway, we saw a lot in there about traditional welfare to work, as was still at play at that time, real traditional approaches to how you could get your economy moving. What it didn't do so much was thinking about everything that we've been discussing here in the round. So we know that skills, education, health, our social infrastructure, as we call it, is so integral to economic outcomes. And slowly but surely, we've been chipping away at government in recognising this, and local leaders have been calling more and more for these powers to be built into their devolved power arrangements. And the Greater Manchester model is the most far-reaching in that respect, actually outstripping Greater London in many respects. Because of the flexibility it has predominantly over joint health and social care commissioning. And government is excited about this approach and is looking to expand it. And so when we finally get this devolution and low inclusive recovery white paper, I really am expecting them to push harder on this mayoral combined authority model. And CPP would support that. It would also support the increased delivery and co-design at a more local authority level where that's appropriate. And we've heard a lot this afternoon about inclusive growth as a process and the role of community and community engagement and discussion and visioning and identity, and that can be as much at a local authority level as it can be at a strategic combined authority level. So it's important to recognise that balance. And then finally, CPP would support the idea of the equivalent of a Northern Powerhouse or Midlands engine, but definitely on a non-statutory functioning level. So this means that it would be kind of a collaborative body, an advocacy body, rather than another tier of government, because what we really would want to do is enable that strategic policy and investment decision making at the mayoral combined authority level. And before I hand over to Dan, I would just emphasise that we think at a maximum this could involve integrating budgets right across the totality of public sector spend, so that you could pool both economic and social policy in terms of your resourcing and accountability mechanisms and structures in order to deliver a real shift in outcomes. And we think that to achieve inclusive growth or levelling up, that's got to happen. And I'm just going to hand over to Dan very briefly to talk about the kinds of ideas that we're starting to see in some of our inclusive growth network places.
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks everyone for your contributions to what's been a really interesting discussion. So I'm just going to close by talking briefly to our inclusive growth network, and as Charlotte says, some of the sort of priorities and action that's emerging from there. So Centre for Progressive Policy are the hosts of the network, which I'm very excited to say launched just last week, and it's fully funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. As Zoe said, the network brings together 12 councils and combined authorities from across the UK, leading the drive for more inclusive economies. And what our intention is that the network will act as an incubator for new ideas that will deliver real change within communities. And to deliver on this, our members will have access to a package of peer-to-peer and tailored support set around a group of priorities which they've identified. And I just wanted to very briefly touch on a few of these priorities, which I think showcase not only the power of local innovation led by councils and combined authorities, but also the potential and the necessity of further devolution. So really interested to hear further examples from others and how devolution could help advance your ambitions. So a key priority for the Inclusive Growth Network support this year will be planning for recovery and the local implementation of these plans. So some areas have already published emerging recovery plans, such as the Build Back Better proposal, which has been produced by the Liverpool City region. I think is really interesting because it builds on examples from places like Bristol of a real sort of pan-institutional vision for a city or city region in this case, with widespread buy-in from not only local and combined authority, but also business, higher education, and a network of other stakeholders within a place. And I think the interesting thing about Liverpool City Region's plan is that it reflects on the need for delivery at different spatial levels that Charlotte has just touched upon. So combined authority and local level, but also national leadership that's needed on issues such as taxation to support businesses, with local leadership needed on issues where more tailored responses are required, like business support. There's obviously a spectrum of views on what a model of recovery should look like, but I think one thing there is almost widespread support for is the concept of a green recovery, which is another key priority for the Inclusive Growth Network members and something we'll be looking to support them on. Local government, I think it's fair to say, is really driving the decarbonisation agenda. And that's certainly true of our network members, all of whom have declared a climate emergency. And to take one example that's already been mentioned, of Greater Manchester, they've set a carbon neutral target more ambitious than the national target. So their local or regional target is 2038. And they've got a number of ambitious proposals to meet this, including the introduction of a city region-wide clean air zone in 2022. And despite this leadership, it's an area where I think further investment and devolution is going to be critical. The Mayor of Sheffield City Region has recently called for game-changing investment to support his and the North's radical decarbonisation plans. And one policy proposal I'm particularly fond of is the planting of a new northern forest, but that obviously necessitates greater investment in devolution. And the final priority from the network I wanted to draw out is the good work agenda, which has been a topic of a lot of national debate given the impacts of the pandemic on unemployment. And as alluded to in this conversation already, those impacts are likely, unfortunately, to be felt over the coming months as well. And despite this and the sort of perceived trade-off between any job and good jobs, the good work agenda remains a priority for the network and for local and combined authorities across the country. And that's well demonstrated by work that continues in places such as the North of Tyne on good work pledges and the development of fair employment charters in places like Greater Manchester and Liverpool City Region. I think linked to Anna's question earlier, employment and skills devolution could play a really important role in advancing this agenda. It's certainly one that's at the top of the sort of Devo shopping list for many combined authorities and the wider local government sector as well. So that's a very brief snapshot of a few of the emerging priorities from our early work with the Inclusive Growth Network. And I think what they show, along with just a few of the brief examples that I've referenced, is the sort of value of local leadership and innovation, but also the potential of devolution in driving our national recovery through local action. It's absolutely critical that the upcoming devolution and local recovery white paper that Charlotte mentions reflects this. So CBP will certainly be supporting members of the Inclusive Growth Network to accelerate this activity through our support. What I'm also really keen to ensure we do is that we share our learning wider to ensure that other places can benefit from this as well. So if you want to find out more about the Inclusive Growth Network, keep up to date with the latest developments, you can follow us on Twitter, just search Inclusive Growth Network, and I'll post the link in a sec. And you can also access the network website through the CPP homepage, which again, I'll post a link to in a sec. But yeah, really welcome any contributions on local responses and the role of devolution.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Dan. That's a great insight into the network, and we'll be learning as we go, so stay tuned. We have only a few minutes left, and Anthony Smith, who has revealed himself to be Tony Smith of West Midlands fame, has come to ask us about using the crisis to strengthen the case for more Devo. Is Charlotte still there? I think.
Yeah, I'm here.
One if she is. So how can we use the experience of the crisis to strengthen the case for more Devo and prove that a more localised system would be more resilient, more joined up, and would act faster? Which I think is a great question, because we've been asked this a lot at CPP about how is the crisis changing things? Is it that we should just do what we've always been saying but do it faster? Or does this give us something new?
Okay, so my view, personal view, is that I think our whole governance system is at a massive crossroads. I think the very concept of the UK government is fast becoming a myth. I think that the degree to which First Ministers of the devolved administrations have taken on real leadership and played their hand very, very well. That's not a political point. I think it's just one that's widely observed vis-a-vis the UK government, actually does further undermine what is already a fragile union. And so I think there are huge questions there for what we are constitutionally as a capital N nation. I think at a local, in terms of local government, I think the failure of national government to deliver an effective test and trace, track and trace scheme, and the persistent U-turns over the last 6 months has really, as the leadership is kind of highlighting, causing questions not just about the Conservative government competence, but when local leaders are having to step up and say, we'll design our own systems, I think it really speaks to a level of central government and governance competence too. So I think there's a profound shift taking place that central government will need to respond to, and I don't think it can continue to try and do so in a really heavy-handed way. So we've seen recently increased fines if people don't comply with the rule of six, etc. I think for me that is a kind of central government, again, non-party political point, but a central government that has sort of lost control of its trying to take control and be in control of this virus. And I think credibility and delivery is being demonstrated at a local level, and it's highlighted the extent to which local government resource has been curtailed and hollowed out persistently over the last decade, and yet local government continues to do its best to deliver in the face of all of that. So I think the mayoral combined authorities are giving greater voice to the idea of local government and changing the perception of what it is to be and to represent local people and communities. And I think that could be a significant game changer if we keep that momentum into the May elections next year and thereafter. And I think some profound questions around our very constitutional setup and governance lie ahead.
Brilliant, thank you. Super. Well, that brings this session to a close. As I've said, CPP is utterly focused on health, skills and devolution, three of the key ways that the government or the Labour holding the government to account and setting up their own store can deliver the levelling up agenda. And if any of you want to engage with us further, please do. Please tweet us, message us, and get involved with our policy making process. We've got a paper on levelling up coming up in the next week or so, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And whilst the session is now coming to a close, if anybody would like to stick around for an informal chat, conversation, trying to recreate the real world on the internet, you're very welcome to do so. So without further ado, I'm going to close this session, but do stay online if you'd like to speak to any of the CPP team or indeed each other.